So what we wanted to do this morning, talking with Corey, Ken, and others, is to kind of come in and talk around, high yield, absolutely, right? I mean, if we're in this zone where we're trying to break through a ceiling, we've got some things in here. But really what this is focused around is fertility management and getting our mindset in a place as we start looking at applications of NPK, all our micros. How do we best utilize those for the sufficiency range needed, but also the goals that we're trying to hit? Okay, so this is not a Pioneer sales pitch for seed, a Corteva sales pitch for chemistry programs, biologicals, all those things. This is more in tune with fertility management and maybe doing some things that we've thought about or that we've done in the past that maybe we've gotten away from slightly, okay? So here's the big question we want to answer today, right? So we know genetic gain is real. And I was in Iowa 2 weeks ago at our big agronomy meeting. We bring in agronomists from all over North America, Canada, and U.S., and we kind of get tuned up for the year on what are new innovative things. So when we looked at the genetic gain slides from corn and beans, soybeans have actually caught up with corn on genetic gain. So corn is around 1% to 2% per year, and soybeans have always lagged in that 0.5% to 1%. So if we're talking, just rough math, if we're talking 60 bushel beans, we should expect to get, a couple bushels per year. Now we're getting closer to that 1% per year on genetic gain around soybeans. So that's really brought a lot of things to the forefront. I think personally that there's been more of an emphasis around soybeans, and that can be attributed to a lot of different things, right? We know that soybeans being a crop that continues to grow as we flower, we can put more emphasis in trying to set pods higher in the plant. It could be just mainly due to market price, right? Market price for soybeans has been, pretty good the last couple of years. Everything's been pretty good. I know we're trying to take a little bit of a dip here now, but knowing genetic gain is real with new genetics from Pioneer and all companies. How do we best take advantage of that, right? So you may be in a situation where the last 5 years that your farm average has continued to be 175 on corn, but you've planted the newest products from the newest companies those years, right? If you were just planting the same product that you planted in 2017 and you're doing the same management techniques, right, depending on weather, you would expect the same result. But if you look at genetic gain over time, how do we take advantage of that 1% to 2% per year that the seed companies are bringing to you, okay? So that's what really we're going to focus around today, okay? So let's jump right into it. And look, a lot of what we're going to talk about in this first section is going to be found in this book here. So some of these slides are going to be a little difficult to see. If you'll reach into this yield pyramid book, we'll kind of go through it and you can better have, your visuals will be better as we look through this, okay? So let's start here, right? This is a growing season for corn. We're going to start with nitrogen, right? Nitrogen is the big boy on the block. That's the one everybody's focused on. When we talk about trying to get things right initially, we think about nitrogen and corn. How should we apply it? When should we apply it? And what form should we apply it? Should we go liquid? Should we go dry? And I'll tell you that, there's no exact science right answer for that. So however you're doing it currently, you can apply it to what we're going to look at here today. This isn't just urea. This isn't just ammonium nitrate, which I don't think we can get that anymore, can we, Gilbert? Or vaguely, right? Or UAN. It can apply across all forms of nitrogen, right? I show this in Kentucky on their anhydrous ammonia acres. So let's jump into it. Let's say you were going to put out 220 pounds of nitrogen per year, and your expected yield goal on those better acres would be what? 220, 240 bushels per acre. Okay, so when we think about it in that regard, let's look at how a corn plant is going to use that throughout the season. So of that 220 pounds, roughly 140 pounds is utilized pre-tassel. So pre-flowering before reproduction, okay? 81% of that is utilized once we get into ear set, ear development, and the majority of that is back here when we get into kernel fill, right? I'm not saying that we have to have 81 pounds of nitrogen in the soil profile, but that's just how it's utilized. So when we look at it here, of this 220, right, we know that of that, 37%, roughly 81 pounds, is utilized post. But how much is remobilized from existing plant material and how much is actually taken up from the soil profile? So when we look at these numbers, and you'll be able to see it kind of in the next couple of slides, 31 pounds, if we're talking in pounds, is remobilized out of stalks, lower leaves, upper leaves, and it goes right into this ear set right here. But in this system, we still need to hold 50 pounds in the soil profile if we're talking 220 to 240 bushel corn. So when we think about where we sit today, and we draw a 70-mile circle around Milton, Tennessee, do we think we're able to hold, if everything is put up front, 220 pounds, do we think we have 50 pounds left in this soil profile when we get really these late kernel fill stages? My thought is, especially if we're putting it all on up front in urea, UAN, even anhydrous, that our soils where we are today put us at risk more for denitrification rather than volatility and leaching. Right? We've got pretty good clay content. We're not on beach sands here, or even predominantly sandy soils. So the leaching concern for me is not as high. Volatility, we put it on top of the ground and it doesn't rain for 4 or 5 days and it gases off in the atmosphere. Look, I think we do a pretty good job of getting our nitrogen into the soil profile. And when we're applying it, let's say we're putting down nitrogen April 1st through April 30th, right? We're probably going to catch a rain every couple days, at least one out of every 7 days in that time frame. There are things we can do to help mitigate that risk for volatility, but denitrification being the big one for me. And that's where let's go into it. Denitrification is, in elementary, I went to public school through my whole scholastic career, so that's how I try to explain things, is when microbes in the soil convert usable forms of nitrogen to unusable forms. So usable forms being ammonium, that's the easiest for the plant to uptake. That's the one that corn and grass crops like the best, right? They will also take it up in nitrate forms, but when you get into nitrate forms, we then become more at risk for denitrification and leaching, right? So leaching is moving down, denitrification is turning it into this nitrite form, and then it's being gassed off as a nitrate gas, or nitrite gas rather. So this is what we're trying to stop here, is this conversion. So when we think about Middle Tennessee, right? I think I have it on one of these slides here, so we'll get to it. Let's think about April, May soil conditions. A lot of times we plant when it's a little bit cooler, so that could be in that early April time frame, late March. But when we get into late April, early May, our soil temperatures begin to warm up in the presence of soil moisture. That's when these microbes and bacteria become more active. And their fuel source, to keep them alive, is this nitrogen fertility that we're putting on here, okay? So when we talk about stabilized versus unstabilized, and look, Dean can get way into this with you, and there are a lot of products on the market, right? We have some, Coke has some, everybody is playing in this biologicals market. But if you're looking at stabilizing nitrogen, there are a couple key things that we need to look at. We need to look at what is the active ingredient and what is it actually doing? Because a lot of these things are helping with volatility. A lot of these things are helping with leaching. Some of them are helping with denitrification, and there's even some in the marketplace that are helping with 2 out of the 3, right? So when we look at, all right, we've got a big investment here. If this is even 180 units of nitrogen, that's a pretty big investment, probably your second largest behind seed. So when we look at protecting it and keeping it here in the soil profile in usable forms where we're not gassing off or losing it down through the soil profile, that's a pretty sound agronomic thing that we can use with our nitrogen, okay? So let's talk through denitrification and what it looks like here in Tennessee. Exactly what we talked about. Mid-March through mid-April, we're putting on a portion or all of our nitrogen. And soil temperatures are relatively cool, so we're not losing a lot here. When we get into this planting date time frame, April 15th through June 1st, what we need to remember is we've got a lot of it out there, but the corn plants are in a position where they're not taking up a lot of nutrients. Got small plants, small root structure, and the sufficiency range at that time for not only nitrogen, but all fertility is very, very low. And we're going to look at that in just a minute. But soil temperatures are beginning to warm up, right? And soil moisture, typically we have some in that April 15th through June 1st. You know, we may come in and do lay-by nitrogen at V3 to V7, and that's a pretty common practice, and we can talk about, you know, potassium thiosulfate, where guys are utilizing that to meet some of their sulfur, potash needs, and that time frame has become more popular in this lay-by nitrogen application. But as we talked about, this bacteria becomes more active, and when it becomes more active and we start converting to unusable forms, that's when we're losing that investment that we put on in that April time frame, okay? So when we look at June 1st and we get into July 15th, right, we're getting into reproductive stages. This is really when this uptake of nitrogen is maximized. That's going to be the largest increase and the largest uptake of all of our fertility when corn gets from about here to about tassel timing, because that factory is getting bigger. It takes more fuel to feed that thing, right? And so that's a lot of times where I feel like we've gotten ourselves into trouble as we get into this early July and we're running towards tassel, and we've had some really dry conditions the last couple of years. So we're missing a lot of that uptake, okay? So when we get into July 15th and we're running towards harvest, we are in ear set, ear development, kernel size. This is where we're still needing that 50 pounds that we talked about earlier. Do we have it there? If we've put a big investment and our goal is 220, do we have 50 pounds to get it there? A lot of cases, that's when we see that firing up. And if we see that firing up, nitrogen deficiency symptomology is what the official term is. If we see that too early, we're leaving money on the table. Now look, if we're running towards dent and we're coming down in moisture and we're, you know, a week from black layer and we start to see those bottom leaves show that nitrogen deficiency, I'm okay with that, because we've utilized everything that we had right up to the end. We didn't over apply and we didn't under apply, right? So if we're running close to black layer and we start to see that firing up, as we call it, I'm okay with that. But if we see it and we're getting into those dough stages, milk stages, and that mid-kernel development, and we start to see that firing up, right, that sets us not only up for reduced kernel size, but it can also set us up for stalk quality issues, harvest standability, a lot of other things go into that, okay? And we talked about this. If we're going to look at nitrogen stability, stabilizing our nitrogen investment, okay, when do we do that? At what time? Do we do it here when we're putting on some? Do we do it here when we're coming by with this lay-by, generally in a liquid form? My recommendation would be wherever your largest investment of nitrogen is, that is where we need to stabilize. So if you're putting on 50 here and coming back with 150 here, I'm putting it with the largest investment, with the largest amount of pounds that are going on. Does that make sense? Okay, questions on this? I generally question.
Soils are worse for denitrification.
Right, your heavier soils. The question was, what soils are worse for denitrification? So heavier soils with higher clay content and soils that tend to stay wetter longer. So if you've got river bottoms, if you're working through some river bottoms that don't have tile in them, or if you're working through some river bottoms that could be sandy. We run into that a lot in East Tennessee. When you get into those swags and those valleys, those are some sandier type bottoms, right? That's more of a leaching issue. But heavier soils, that tend to stay wetter natured soils? Good question. Other questions on this? Okay. Let's go into the book now, and let's kind of talk about, okay, we've got nitrogen. We kind of understand where that's at. So let's see how we're utilizing it. I think these are going to be on page 15 will be the first one we look at. And look, take these home with you. There's some resources in here that can really, as you're making fertility decisions, can help you kind of work through that. So this was built out by the Pioneer Agronomy team about 2 or 3 years ago. So how this came about, a lot of you have hosted what we call PKP trials for Pioneer. It's, performance trials with our newest products. And when we started looking at it, we're like, man, we have all of these data points, thousands and thousands of data points with new hybrids. We know the yield on them. We know the planting date. We know the harvest date. We know the moisture. Can we dig into it a little bit deeper and understand fertility that went on to these fields and relate that back to yield and environment, and just capture more data off of what we were already doing to try to bring you guys the best products in our lineup. Okay, so that's how this came about. As we dig into it, this chart right here is worth, I think, you driving here today and spending some time with us. Like I said, this is on page 15. But this really shows you for the majority of nutrients that we're going to focus on, especially in a corn crop, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, zinc, boron, how and when and in what percentages modern day corn hybrids are taking up these nutrients. Okay? So we talked about it briefly, and this is broken out by days, right? So let's just say this is April 20th. On this VE date, we plan on the 15th or 10th, and adjust this however you want to. If you're on wetter natured soils, this may be May 1st, it may be May 15th even, right? Gilbert, for some of your guys. So adjust that how you will. So this isn't tied to a calendar date. It's more tied to crop growth stage, right? And so when we look from VE through V8, you're going to see all of those numbers, no matter what nutrient, are single digits. That's exactly what we would expect. We're seeing a lot of plants that look, they just don't grow off very fast, especially if you're planted in that early April time frame. We're growing off slowly. The nutrient demand is not there, but risk for denitrification and also risk for a lot of these nutrients to move below the soil profile or below the root zone at that time increase. So how many have called Gilbert or Ernie or Ken or Corey at V4 and they're like, man, we have a sulfur issue, or we have a boron issue, or we have a manganese issue because our corn crop is looking pretty haggard. It's pale. We're seeing some interveinal streaking in it. We need to get some sulfur or boron on this crop now, right? What I would tell you is I'm not overly concerned when corn is this tall with interveinal streaking or discoloration, because when we look down here, and you can look in your book, boron, sulfur, at that V4 time frame, they've taken up a total of 3% of what they need for the entire year. So they just haven't taken up a lot. And we know sulfur is kind of tricky in the soil profile anyway. Maybe how we've applied it, it's not in a usable form just yet. We haven't had warmer temperatures to convert over to sulfate forms, all those fun things. So I'm not overly concerned at that point. Even nitrogen, I'm not overly concerned about at that point. Look, the nutrient demand, the uptake demand is not high at that point, and I'm not concerned when we see a little discoloration early. We can see purpling. If you ever planted some of the older Pioneer products, you saw purpling in the presence of cooler temperatures. Where I do get to be concerned is when we start to get chest tall, right? And look, we're starting to pick up nutrients at that point. About a week after you call Gilbert and say, look, we got a problem here, about 95% of the time, that changes over. Now, there could be compaction issues, right? That could be showing us some of this. Compaction issues are going to run us out here too. So we'll know that, right? If we get here and we're still seeing these problems, and we've done a good job of providing the sufficiency for the fertility we're providing, and we're still seeing these issues here with shorter corn, discoloration, it's time to look below ground, maybe not from a nutrient standpoint, but from a root structure, root zone standpoint. Okay, that could be a whole nother day talk around compaction and how we avoid that or how we increase incidence of that. But this is really where I want you to focus, is V12 to tassel time frame. We go from 8-9% of what they need to that rapidly increases as we run towards tasseling, right? Nitrogen here, you're going to take up between V12 and R1, that's almost 60% of the nitrogen that corn plant's going to use throughout its life in that 35-day window, 40-day window. So, knowing that, this is very critical time frame for us for nitrogen. So, if we're doing lay-by, we need to have that in here so it's ready to be uptaken. Now, this is all contingent on in the presence of soil moisture too, right? And I used to be a really firm believer that if we miss this, then it hurts us back here. What we saw this year, if we remember back, and look, I cover a pretty wide geography. I cover a lot in Kentucky, all of middle, all of East Tennessee. I've worked in North Alabama. And when we got into Kentucky last year, we missed a lot of rain between June 1st and July 4th. And that puts it in this time frame. And we had corn that was still growing off pretty good, not as rapidly as we thought. And I was really concerned about this potash uptake right here. You know, that's almost 60% too. I'm afraid if we miss that, it's going to set us up for late season stalk integrity. And I was very impressed to see that when it started raining on July 4th, we saw a lot of corn recover, and we had very good yields. So corn plants can adjust. All plants can adjust. We have to remember we're working with living organisms, and they can pull and take. And if we miss some here, look, we can go get some nutrition, maybe outside of these ranges. But as kind of a guidebook of where we're at, okay? So we know we've got to have a lot here. So now we're going to talk about what are the new kind of main focus micronutrients that high-yield corn growers are talking about. Anybody want to name a couple? Zinc. Zinc's a good one. Hearing a lot of talk around boron, late. Okay? So you can look at this chart and you can quickly decipher, depending on where the nutrient demand back here is higher, what's contributing to ear development. Okay? So when we look at zinc late, absolutely. You know, look, we're looking at 33, almost 40% of zinc that's taken up late. So yeah, that's directly, in my mind, contributing to late season ear development. We look at boron. Boron's taking up a big slug here as we go into that ear set, right? We'll talk a little bit about boron and how best to apply that. But these micronutrients we talk about, sulfur, zinc, boron, a lot of these are contributing to this ear set and this kernel fill. And that's why they're getting a lot of attention in the marketplace over and above aluminum and iron and all these other things. That's why the focus has been more on those, is because we're able to influence yield here with these micronutrients if we have our big three, big four taken care of initially. Okay? So if you're going to go out here and put on 6 pounds of boron late, but we missed 30 pounds of potash here, probably not going to do a lot for us. If we're clicking along and we're running into ceilings, look, man, we can make 220. We're having trouble breaking over that. Our NP and K is good. Where are the next places we look? Okay, we come down here, and then we start to figure that out. Okay? All that comes with this, though. So if you flip one more, or two more. I think it's on the very last page, and some of these books may not have it. We look at nutrient interactions. So these are stimulations versus antagonism. And it's not like some of the chemistry products we spray with Dean, you know, more is better. If a little bit is good, more is better, right? You know, if a quart of Roundup is good, 2 quarts got to be better. It's all about balance with nutrition and fertility, right? You can see we talked about the big boys on the block. You can see what the big bullies in the soil profile are just by looking here, right? Calcium, big. And look, I know we're in high calcitic soils here, using calcitic lime in a lot of areas, in most areas. So this may be hindering us initially when we're looking at what are our calcium levels in our soil test. Could that be hindering us with exactly what we talked about? Zinc. We talk about zinc. We talk about boron, our P's and our K's. So if our calcium levels are way out the roof when we're looking at soil testing because of years and years and generations of using calcitic lime, what's available to us to try to keep pH in check here, could this be contributing to some of our yield decrease in magnesium? Yeah, so we're clicking along pretty good here. We start looking at mag, you're okay here. So things to check if we're looking at soil test, right? Keep this book with you, throw it on the dash. We're looking here, okay, what are we high in? And then adjust accordingly as we look at soil test. I won't spend a lot of time here, but it's in the book, and it breaks you out through ranges. If you're at 160 and you're trying to get 180, you can flip through this, and there's some management techniques in there. And it says Eastern Corn Belt, and the way they classify these books, we would fall pretty close in the Eastern Corn Belt. We more align with some of those soil types as you go north of us into Ohio and different places. The Mid-South is more built around lighter textured soils. But you can see here, look, it's just some quick hit management techniques. This is going from 220 and we're trying to get to 250. So where should our pH be? Where should our pK, some of these micros be? So just take some time and look through that if you're trying to jump a yield level. But a lot of this is going to focus, right? I pulled 4 points out of here. Looking at split applying your nitrogen if you're not doing that, or protecting your nitrogen. Population increase could be a thing that we move towards in the past, right? If we're clicking along, we've got all this fertility here, and we're still hitting that same number, and we're not seeing stalk degradation late. We're seeing standability is good with our corn crop, right? If we're harvesting at a little higher moisture, if we have access to a dryer, those are places automatically we can look at putting 2 more thousand. Because we got to remember, corn is a numbers game. Corn is, we've got this many stalks in the field. If it's 30,000 final or if it's 28,000 final, that's what we've got. And we're going to get one good ear off of 28,000 plants, and they're all going to be in a range of 16 to 18 around, and they're going to be 40 long, and then how deep are the kernels going to be, right? If you can get that calculation right, you can get within 15 bushels of what you're going to make at the end of the year. As opposed to soybeans, right, you could bring 10 soybean plants in that back door if it was harvest time and show them to me, and I probably couldn't get within 10 or 15 bushels of them, right? They're just hard because it's all weight. We can count pods, but it's all how big are those beans in that pod. That's really what drives that, and that's why I feel like we can increase yields a little more quickly in soybeans. Okay.
Before you get too far,
yes.
Got 2 questions.
Yep.
What's your opinion on putting the micros down pre with dry fertilizer versus foliar? And 2, what's your opinion on the difference between these newer foliar liquids that supposedly get in the plant better versus just a generic like boron?
Yep. So I'm going to give you Kyle's opinion on this, right? I'm not saying it's the right opinion. I'm just saying it's Kyle's opinion. If I'm looking at spending X amount of dollars for micronutrient packs, the first thing I'm going to check is I'm going to look at the label on that micro pack, right? and I'm going to see how many pounds per acre. Right, when we get into zincs and borons, look, we don't need a lot for sufficiency. We're talking like 0.8, 0.9 is the sufficiency range, but we know we have to have more out there than that to get into the plant. Okay, so what I would tell you around foliars is if we have everything clicking along, and look, our baseline fertility is good, and our zincs and our borons and our sulfurs and our irons and all these things, when we pull soil tests and we pull early tissue tests, and that's the next couple of slides, if we're in that sufficient range and we're trying to go higher on yield and we want to spray a foliar product of zinc or boron at fungicide timing, absolutely. Because we don't need a lot of pounds of those materials. And if we can get them into the plant, and I know that world is constantly evolving, and we're talking about stomatal opening and when to spray it, and they've got things in there that help it get into the plant. As long as our baseline fertility and our tissue testing is showing that we're sufficient in those nutrients, that's a good plan. What it won't do for you is it's not going to fix a large deficiency in micronutrients. Does that make sense? If you're looking at tissue testing and we're running up towards tassel and we're getting into ear development and we're pulling that ear leaf and it's showing deficiency, that 0.5 pounds of boron is not going to fix that at that point. Okay? But it will enhance it if everything else looks good on that page. Fair? Comments around that? Okay. The first part of that question was your opinion on micronutrients pre-plant with your other dry fertilizer. Absolutely. Right.
Get that right first.
Get that right first. Set ourselves up as we get in the backside of that crop. If we want to push on boron a little harder, for instance, we can do that. Now, a lot of our micronutrients also need to be in a tiered approach, exactly what you're talking about. So we wouldn't want to wait. Let's go back here. We wouldn't want to wait and come back here and try to put 10 pounds of boron on to meet our sufficiency range back here, right? It needs to be in that tiered approach. Put some here. We can put some in the lay-by, put some here. Because what you can see is, one, it can't take up that much that quickly. If it does, especially with products like boron that go to that actively growing tissue, some of these really high yield guys that have tried to put big slugs on late, you can see some boron toxicity, and that is causing ear malformation late season for them. So tiered approach, especially with some of those chemistries. Now, sulfur shouldn't be a problem. If you're putting on a bunch of sulfur foliarly here, you're at risk for increased burn. You could burn some of the leaves up, and nitrogen too, obviously, right? Nitrogen spiked with sulfur. When you have a lot of foliage out there, you could set yourself up for some foliar burn there. But tiered approach, and if we want to use foliars back here late, right, coming into this fungicide timing, absolutely, as long as we've met that demand early. Okay. So let's talk about that a little bit. Oh, let's stop here, and then we'll get into tissues. All right, so here are things as I move around, and I talk with these guys, and some of them I'm in pretty good contact with, some of these really high yield guys in Alabama and other places. And my colleagues to the east of me are, they picked the hybrids for David Hula and those guys. So when we talk about, they're using thousands of dollars of management on 5 acres, right? Thousands of dollars. The soybean guy that you saw in the Delta Farm Press, or you saw on, whatever your favorite ag news is online. That guy's down south in South Georgia. He spent like thousands of dollars per acre to get that done. Like $2,200 per acre to get 160 bushels of soybeans or 180. That guy's also a rep for a foliar biologicals company too. So every day he went out there, every 5 days went out there and was running a sprayer in it. So, we see these big headlines in the publications we read. And can we get there? Absolutely. Do we have the time to get there? I mean, maybe some of you do on 5 acres. Realistically, on large acres that pay our bills, right? Small steps, common sense, bringing in some of these innovative things we're not thinking about, okay? So let's talk first about, when we talk about kind of things that some of these guys are doing outside the presence of irrigation that's paying for them, is we start looking at deep banding P's and K's, especially K here with potash. And the reason being that they're seeing a return on this is the weather patterns we've had over the last couple of years. So if we can get P and K, and look, I know we might have to drag something out of the fence row. We're probably not utilizing a lot of things that are banding products anymore. Maybe with your lay-by, you still have some of those pieces of machinery around. But if we get that down into that soil profile in that lay-by application at 6-7 inches, and it's there, the chances of us having soil moisture during critical times for that corn plant are higher at 6 and 7 inches than they are at 1 or 2 inches. So if we just broadcast potash out there and it works its way into the soil profile at 1 or 2 inches, and we get into mid-June through July, and that top 2 inches of the soil dries out, fertility can't be taken up because mass flow is not happening with water. Root extension probably is happening, but at a much slower rate in those dry soils. But if we push it down a little bit, the chances of us having that moisture in the soil profile there are going to be there, and that can be taken up, right? So that's where we're seeing that return. Is in dry years, this pays almost every year, right? I mean, if it rains for 120 days throughout the summer, you might not get the benefit of this, but the chances of that happening are slim. Split nitrogen applications, we talked about that. Stabilizers, nitrogen to sulfur ratios. This is moving. This is a constantly moving target. 10-to-1 is good for a 200 bushel crop. When you go higher than that, when you go to 400 bushels with David Hula, that number shrinks, right? That number is getting closer to like 7-to-1. So the focus on boron, we talked about the tiered approach, and then this root growth promoters. Because when we talk about fertility, roots are the main thing that are driving that. And so we know, right, through interception in the soil profile, either through mass flow with water movement, but that root interception is how a lot of these nutrients are taken up, and we won't get into all that today. But a bigger root zone gives us a bigger bucket to throw things into to be taken up to the plant, okay? And I always mention this, right? Biologicals are huge right now. Every company's getting into them for a lot of different reasons, right? One, they don't have to go through EPA registration, but a lot of these things work, right? You could fill up this room plus 100 with biological salesmen. So everybody has something out there. And I'm not saying that all of them work. I'm not saying that all of them don't work. I'm saying that it's kind of a tricky minefield to walk through to understand how they work, okay? There's a couple different things. We got plant hormones that we're using. We've got bacillus and bacterial strains that we're using. There's a lot of different things. But if you're talking with biological people that are selling these and they're not talking to you about your water, then that's probably a pretty good indication from the first start that, look, I'm not sure about this. Because a lot of these things we're using, whether they're plant hormones, and especially when we start looking into, bacillus strains and microbial strains and those types of things, when we're talking about in the presence of chlorine or we're talking about in the presence of different pHs in water, those things can immediately negate the effects and kill that biology that's in there. So think about those things. And look, again, we could talk about that for hours in here today. And I have some slides that I hid. And if you want to look through how some of that works, catch me after. But yeah, biologicals are big. You're going to continue to hear more about them. But they all play back into exactly what we talked about. Baseline fertility, having that right first. Okay? So let's get into question.
You may be getting into it later, but the second part of that question, generic boron just versus, a branded product with something to help it fit into the tissue. A lot of times you can get 4 or 5 times the amount of boron for the price as if you're using like a branded product with something that's supposed to help get in the tissue.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the second part.
Yeah, so good call, Kyle. Thank you for that. So yeah, look, there's a million things working out there, and everybody's got a special adjuvant that is helping drive nutrition into the plant when the stomates are open between 7 and 8 o'clock at night, and we're respiring in the corn plant. So I would say do your homework on that. Use your trusted advisors to help guide you through that. Whether that's Cal or Gilbert or whoever your favorite local micronutrient salesperson is, because there's a lot out there, right? And things have evolved. There's no doubt. I mean, how many in this room have used Tiger sulfur in the past in the bag, right? That nasty, it was pelletized elemental sulfur. Hell, we'll just mix it in with the P and K, and it got to work, right? That stuff takes like 2 or 3 years to break down and become fully available to the plant in the elemental form that it was in. So understanding to that question, what forms can the plant take up? And it's usually the 8 forms, right? Sulfates, nitrates, phosphates, those types of things. So understanding that initially is it's readily available to the plant. We don't have to use soil biology to convert from these forms to these forms for it to be taken up. So if it's readily available to the plant, right, that's good. But that doesn't mean that every pound is going to get into the plant also. Okay. All right, so let's talk through this quickly here. This is the great tissue testing debate, and I'm gonna kind of go through that. What we just talked about is really what I wanted to drive home. That's why we started there, and then we'll get into soybeans. But me and Ken were actually talking about this earlier, so I put this in here. Look, this space is evolving rapidly too. This is on-demand tissue testing. There's some conversations around availability of these, how we're going to utilize these in the field, those types of things. I don't have one. To my knowledge, maybe only 1 or 2 exist within the whole Pioneer world across North America. But on-demand tissue testing, Leaf Tech is who makes this. You can read more about it, or Ken can tell you. I think he's been doing a little research, but showing you what's in there right now today. Okay, so when we get into tissue testing, right, this is typically what we look at. If you pull one, or somebody from co-op comes out and pulls one, you're going to get a report that looks like this. And hey, man, this is great, right? There's a lot of green on there. There's an orange out here. It's very high. What do we do with this? The thing to remember with tissue testing is you are a snapshot in time. And if it's been dry for 2 weeks and you pull this, it could look a lot different than if it rained the previous 2 days. So understand that, right? Best practices, I think I have a slide in here, is look, we want to test in the presence of rainfall or immediately following some rainfall to get the best reads here. But also having this, and if you have one that was 2 weeks prior and 2 weeks prior to that, and you're going to pull one that's 10 days past this, that's the best way to utilize this, because you can then see trends in how nutrients are residing in your leaf tissue, right? And if you want some best management on how and when and where to pull from the plant, we can provide all that to you. It's not rocket science. It's taking the time to pull them, put them in a bag, send them, and then wait on your report to come back, okay? But having multiple tests within that growing season lets you be able to then see, how are we tracking on boron? How are we tracking on zinc? Do we need to correct something here? This was 15-inch corn. Do we need to start correcting, zinc here that we're trying to fall into this low range. Well, what did the previous test tell us? What does the one here tell us 2 weeks past this? Then we can start to make those decisions. Do we need a foliar application? Do we need to be dropping something in when we spray with the airplane, helicopter, or is the corn still small enough that we can get over the top of it with lay-by rig, Hagee, something like that? Okay, so these are powerful tools. It's just utilizing them correctly. Honestly, one tissue test, looking at it and making a decision on it, probably not going to do a lot for you. It's a beautiful, pretty map to look at, and you can pat yourself on the back when they're all over here green, but not being able to see how that's working throughout the year, in my opinion, honestly, one tissue test probably not doing a whole lot for you. Okay, besides just seeing how you're tracking. Okay, there's some things we can do when we talk about high yield corn. So I skipped over this, but this is another thing that we did within Pioneer, where we tissue tested all these PKP plots and then broke them out into yield ranges. So when we look kind of across the Tennessee Valley here, yeah, look, we were somewhere between 220 and 240. You also have to remember that's about 20% higher than what you're encountering in the field, because we're measuring those things off exactly, and they're generally on better ground for consistency, so we get good yield data. So if you put that into actual practice, that number is probably 190 to 220. Is what we looked at here, right? But when we characterized them out, we were able to look at this tissue test, put a formula together by adding a lot of these high nutrients together, and then when we get into parts per million, you convert those over to pounds, and there's a calculation to do that. But when you add all of that together, and this one at V6 came out at 7.89, then you can put them into these buckets, okay? So at V6 on that plot, look, this number here is 7.8, so we still have maximum yield potential here. What is driving this final number is a lot around these top nutrients, right? When you get down here, right, you're getting into 0.03s, 0.004s, all these things. But your big buckets are driving your yield. Your nitrogen, especially your P's and your K's, okay? So this is interesting too. It's when we look at tissue testing and we're going up, so we want to be in the highest range here at V6 to V8. We're starting to see a leveling off as we get into reproductive stages, but the highest ranges for yield actually correspond with lower values on tissue tests late. Does anybody want to take a guess as to why that would be? High early from tissue and lower values late correspond with yield. 100%. Same with soybeans. You want to be as high as possible on your tissue test in vegetative stages, and you want them to be as low as possible when you get into grain fill or pod fill with soybeans. Because we're not testing the ear. We're not testing the stalk generally. We're not testing beans. We're testing leaf tissue. And so that is a really good indication of we had a lot of nitrogen in that leaf material. It was holding it in there, waiting for reproductive stages. When that ear sets, it's going right into that ear set, and we want it to come out of that leaf material and into that ear. So starting high and finishing on the low side is actually a very good thing. I mean, we think about that with potash and soybeans. We won't get into it, but with potash and soybeans, I mean, you need to be clicking up there like 5 and 6%, and you want to try to finish as low as possible. If you're 5 and 6%, and then you get down here and you're in pod fill and you've only gone to like 4, then you probably don't have a very good bean crop, right? And I'll have to check those numbers, but because of that, we were able to do some of that, okay? And when you look in here, we have broken that out for you in a take-home around the highest yielding out of all those locations. This is nitrogen and corn and soybean potash. But when we look here on this page, you'll see that these are the ranges. If you were going to maximize yield, these would be the ranges that you would want to fall into at different levels. Okay, and you can talk about exactly what we said, that 3.8 to 4.1 on nitrogen early, and you want to finish somewhere in that 2.6 to 3.0 range. So you want to see that decrease. So you can use this kind of as a guide on looking at your tissues if you're going to pull some and where you fall out within those ranges. And if you're falling out below those on any of that, and I would say really, nitrogen, phosphate, potash, sulfur, boron, zinc would be the ones I would focus on. If you're falling out below any of those, then you could probably tell yourself, okay, look, we may not have a 240 bushel crop or a 220 bushel crop, whatever your high end is, but we're pretty close to that. And if you're falling out way below those, especially in those early ranges, V6 and VT, then that's when we need to start looking at correction. Okay, and here it is here. All right, so tissue testing best practices. We've talked about this, so I won't berate you with it, but often used to diagnose nutrient deficiencies after visual symptoms appear. Would you agree with that? Oh man, we look like we're running low on something out here, and we got a pale crop. And look, remember, corn goes through an ugly stage. It does it every year. And Gilbert and them guys, y'all get tons of calls. Man, this corn looks like hell, right? It goes through ugly stages throughout the year. A lot of times we'll go out there and pull a tissue sample and be like, oh, let's see what's going on. It's used for visual symptomology and not for understanding trends within the nutrient or trends within the plant. Okay, exactly what we're talking about. We rarely use it to proactively track how we're trending. And what we talked about when we're looking at pulling multiple samples throughout the year, I would encourage you to choose a couple of those fields where you have the highest yield potential on your farm and go ahead and pre-plan to do that. Something close to the house, close to the shop, something you drive by every day. Kyle, get you some bags and set you up a waypoint account or send them in, but just to look at tracking on what you're doing there. And that way, if your highest yielding, most valuable acre, if you have an issue or a perceived issue, you've got time for corrective measures there. Okay? Questions around tissue testing and how we utilize it to increase production. All right, a couple more things here. So, in complete honesty, I have borrowed some of these slides in this from Sean Castile with the University of Purdue because he already had them built, and it helped me out. But the fact remains the same, is that as we switch over to talking about soybeans, where sulfur has been a major focus for our grass crops in the past, as we start looking at broadleaf crops, that this sulfur component, especially with legumes, is driving a lot of yield that we didn't think necessarily that it might have been doing in the past. Okay, and we're going to talk about why that is. The gist of it, before we get into the more technical things, is sulfur is being found to increase nodulation late in soybeans. So when we talk about nodulation in soybeans, right, we nodulate throughout the whole growing season. Usually starts and get several trifoliates on a soybean plant. And those nodules are good from anywhere to, 2 weeks, 14 to 20 days, and then they slough off and more are generated throughout that time frame. But when we look at in the presence of soils that are higher in sulfur in the root zone, maybe not necessarily foliarly, but in the root zone, we're seeing increased nodulation. And increased nodulation is driving us to increase nitrogen, which is driving us to increase late season nitrogen, which is in turn providing us yield. Okay? So we won't go through the sulfur cycle. It's less complicated than nitrogen. Let's just say that. But when you set the foundation on it, when we talk about high soybean management, what are we looking at? So all of these things are going to line up with what we're doing today in this room, right? Varietal selection. Look, we're picking good varieties. the guys in this room that are helping you are not sending you out bad varieties, right? They're picking good varieties, the latest genetics from us or others that give you the best chance at success, right? And they do their homework on that, and they have a lot of guys that come in and talk to them about this works here and this works here and this works here. So I have every confidence there. When we look at row spacing, we're doing this. We're on generally 7.5s to 15s. So canopy closure, sunlight interception is what's driving a lot of that. That's where we're getting a boost from these narrow rows, is this sunlight interception. So we got more plants out there in a smaller area, maybe not more plants, but we're capturing more sunlight, less sunlight hitting the ground. We can talk about plant stands and timely planting. Again, borrowed this from Purdue, but early planting has increased soybean yields over the last 8 years, probably more than anything. And look, I understand. I see a lot of faces looking at me. I know where we're at today. I know where we're sitting. And as you go south of us, as you go south and east of Murfreesboro, it's like farming in a bathtub in a lot of instances. It's either all the way wet, and then on June 1st, it's all the way dry. So I get it that not every acre represented in here can go plant a soybean on April 15th. But if you have that option, it's a great option to take advantage of from a soybean yield perspective. It brings in other management techniques that maybe we're not thinking about. So when we tried to start doing this down around where Brent lives, right, you get down around Manchester, the home of cover crops, and we try to start planting soybeans into cover crops and killing those off and getting soybeans planted April 20th, right, what happens then? Increased slug pressure. And so we planted them on April 20th, we planted them again on May 5th, and then we planted them again on May 30th, and we finally got a stand, right? So understand that it's not just load the beans in the planter on April 15th and go out there and plant. If you've got a pretty clean seed bed, it works pretty good. If you've got a lot of corn residue out there, if you've got a lot of cover crop residue out there, and we're going to be in a cooling trend for like 2 weeks, you're going to bring in more issues. So understand that. But in the absence of cover crop, heavy corn residue, if we're on a warming trend that can help us negate some of that slug activity, early planting is driving a lot of soybean yield, not only across the South, but across the whole U.S. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, exactly what we just talked about. So let's look at sulfur interaction with soybeans. We've all seen beans that look like this, right? And look, some of this could be varietal. Some of this can be varietal. You can have beans that tend to be darker colors than others, right? So we see it in our strip plots all the time. But where you're seeing areas of the field or you're planting the same beans across a lot of acres and you're driving by and they're planted pretty close in planting date, and man, this field over here looks like this, and then this one over here looks like this, right? Begin to think back around, how has this acre been treated differently than this acre? Did we have corn here? We had wheat here where we put a lot of sulfur on over the last couple of years. Is this a new farm that we're picking up, or coming out of pasture or something that has had minimal fertility done to it? So begin to think about that. But when we look at the reason for this is untreated check without sulfur, right? Around nodulation, late season, you see a lot of these nodules have begun to peel off. And when we look at something like 20 pounds of ammonium sulfate, and we have some recommendations, and they're actually on the table, and I'm going to show them to you, right? This right here is showing us that nodulation is increasing in the presence of sulfur. And sulfur is not something we've been terribly focused on in our soybean crop. It's all hinged around potash. The majority of fertility recommendations in soybeans are all hinging around potash and in-season potash. And look, we need that. Absolutely. It is the main focus. But sulfur is also bringing us some here too. Okay. A lot of this is done pre-plant. Look, I am not recommending this pre-plant. I am looking at it in season. But if 17 units of nitrogen early season is not going to hurt us. It's not going to make soybean plants lazy. If we get into that 30, 40 pound range, we could decrease nodulation because we're getting a sufficient amount of nitrogen through fertility practices, and it'll cause it not to utilize its crop ecology, biology, all these things to make nodules, right? But you can see here, untreated check, but in the presence of sulfur in these columns, as we look here, how we're able to increase on early planted soybeans. Not as widely effective in later planted soybeans, but early planted in the presence of sulfur is driving yield, okay? We'll get to that in a little bit. So this is also important to understand. You could take a picture of this or come up after and take a picture of my screen. But this is the nutrient removal, and I don't have it broken out by time frame. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But when we look at, this is grain removal. So this is what's coming off with the grain. I have put the sufficiency or what is needed throughout the growing season, the total uptake in these. So when we look at, let's look at K. Let's start with K. If you're trying to grow 60 bushel beans, and we're looking at a number for K for total plant uptake, not grain removal, that number is 140. If we're trying to go from here to 100 bushels, that number goes from 138 to 230. So understand that when you get higher in soybean yield, your nutrient uptake and the nutrient demand for those crops goes up exponentially. It's not just a percent basis, right? Let's look at sulfur. All right, so 40, 60 bushel beans, look, we're hinging around this 8 to 13. When you go up to 100, we're looking at 21 pounds of sulfur. And my calculations are closer to 25 as we get later in the presentation. But just understand that these numbers in parentheses, as you come across, is where we need to try to drive, where we need to be from a sufficiency range to drive yield, okay? Questions on this, and we're going to get into it a little bit more as we get closer to lunch.
Those numbers are higher than the rule of thumb numbers we've always had. Correct?
I would agree. What is, okay, so let me ask you this. Great point. If you're wanting to grow a 50 bushel soybean, typically what do you think that your total plant uptake sufficiency that you would apply would be when you turn in your fertility order to Gilbert if you had a couple pounds out there? I would say it's 100 pounds of potash, right? How many people have put 100 pounds of potash on fields trying to make 60 bushels? How many have done it? A lot. A lot have done it. But when you start coming across here, even 60 bushels here, this number 148 or 138 rather, it's much higher than what we typically think. So what we've done is we've been able to maximize efficiency on a lot of these acres, probably due to having a couple bad years in there at some point. That's probably why we're able to skirt by with 100 pounds of potash, and in a good year, we can still make 60, 70 bushel beans. Is because chances are in the last 4 or 5 years, we've probably had a corn crop that was way below average. And so we're able to hold some of that throughout the season and throughout a couple of years. You wouldn't get that with nitrogen, but some of these other products on a build scenario with P and K, you would be able to see that, right?
So kind of the,
Please do.
All right. Fairly typically around here, we're putting 100 to 150 pounds of phosphate. Okay, I'm talking pounds of fertilizer, and we're putting somewhere around 200 pounds of potash. We're getting a lot of 70 bushel yields on the good fields that everything's happy. To go higher, you're going to have to put more groceries. Does that make any sense? And that's, of course, that's a damn fertilizer. So
It does.
get that out of the way.
Yeah, those look, I've got that 100 bushel protocol in front of you, and we're going to get to it. The key to remember with soybeans is if you're at 60 bushels right now, and you've averaged out 60 bushels for 5 years, even 65, it is almost impossible to go from 60 to 65 bushels to 100. You can go from 60 to 80 and from 80 to 100, but it is very, very unlikely that you will take that 60 bushel acre today and make it make 100 next year. Okay? And there's some things we can do, obviously, to try to do that. But what I'm going to show you at the end of this presentation is if you're at 80, how do you take that next step to 100? Because the physiology of that plant is completely different. It's making enough today to make 60 and 70 bushels from a nitrogen perspective. And we're probably getting by, we're probably over maximizing our P and K here. But when you start jumping 80 and above, Gilbert's right. I mean, these numbers are critical to take you higher. Okay? That's a great lead in. And you too can grow 100 bushel beans. I mean, we've done it. What I've got on the table in front of you, that protocol, and look, that thing is ever changing, ever evolving in how we utilize it, the growers we utilize it with. It used to be, 150 pounds of K-Mag prior to R1 to drive potash. Once we started looking at sulfur and nitrogen, and we're going to talk about why, it's evolved into 100 pounds of AMS. If you're above 75 bushels, works almost every time. But I think the sulfur is driving it more than the nitrogen, but there are reasons why. Okay? So let's talk about planting date. We mentioned it, but we didn't really get into the why on soybeans that planting date is so important. We just threw a number out there, right? April 15th, that's a great day. April 20th, go plant soybeans. You'll love it. It's going to be great. But the science behind it, I think, will make sense to everyone in this room into why we are targeting that mid-April timeframe. Okay? So when we look at the longest day of the year, June 20th, around that time, I remember that because that's my birthday, somewhere around that June 20th date, that is our maximum sunlight day. Summer solstice, right? Is that what they say? So that is the longest day length we get. And on either side of that, we're working up and away from that. So that week of June the 10th through July the 4th, 5th, those are critical times when we're looking at maximizing soybean yield. Okay? So why is that? Like if you were going to plant a 3.9 here, you'd be outside that date, April 15th. If you were going to plant a 5.9, you'd be outside that date. Now let me preface this by saying that when we look at high yield beans, and look, when I think high yield beans, I'm trying to get over 95, I'm trying to get over 100, right? Year in and year out for this geography that I've worked for the majority of my professional career, going on 15, 16 years, a 3.9, 4.0, 4.2 planted April 20th on a 10-year average will be the highest yielding acre you have. You agree with that, Nick? However, you're going to have some years where your 4.7s are better that are planted in April. You're going to have some years where a 4.5 or a 5.1 are better planted in April. But from a consistency standpoint, from an average yield standpoint, man, that 4.2 to 4.7, and mainly that 3.9 through 4.2, consistency, bang for buck, that's it, right? But if we're looking at increasing yield on acres that are highly productive, as we move, this should really be like a 4.7. It says 4.9, but somewhere 4.7 to 4.9. If we're looking to really top some acres out, that's where we need to be. And the reason behind it being this, okay? As an agronomist, I always have an out with the weather, but I have to assume, I have to plan for success until I'm told otherwise from a weather perspective. In the presence of soil moisture, and we're looking longest days of the year, what's up? Photosynthetic rate, right? We're running into, oh, I didn't mention this. So where is this at longest day of the year? This is R3, R1, R2, R3. So this is a little bit earlier than we're thinking about spraying fungicides. We're not really thinking about spraying fungicides on June the 20th through July 4th. We're more focused on corn fungicides at that point than we are soybean fungicides, right? So somewhere full flower, I would consider full flower R2. I think R3, we're getting a little bit later, but full flower R2, okay? So what happens there on June 20th when we're at full flower? Photosynthetic rate is up. In turn, increases water uptake. What's in our water that's being uptaken? Our fertility. So increased nutrient uptake if our plants are healthy, reducing abiotic stresses to the plant. If our fertility program is good, we're sticking more flowers, and more flowers in turn equal more pods equal more beans. Higher weights on those beans increase our yield. Does that make sense to everybody? So how do we reduce abiotic stress outside of fertility and weather? Okay, so this is a little bit of a look behind the curtain at some of these guys that are punching out hundreds every year. And there's more of that going on out there than you think. And there's probably some guys in this room that are looking at me saying, yeah, hell, I've hit 100. That ain't no big deal. But your neighbors probably don't know that you have, right? We get a lot of that too. So growers that are consistently topping out some high yields, things we're not talking about. Look, we understand this. We understand R3. And what we didn't understand, I worked with Melvin Newman for a lot of years. A lot of you guys know Dr. Newman, passed away, I think 2 years ago, but plant pathologist with the University of Tennessee. What we didn't understand in 2003 right here was this had more benefit to us than controlling frog eye leaf spot. Because that's what we were looking at. We were trying to spray R3 so we could keep frog eye leaf spot off these beans as they go into maturity and they'll hold their leaves. And what we didn't understand until about 2006 was this fungicide application was keeping this bean alive longer 10 more days. That's where the yield was coming from. In the absence of frog eye, Asian soybean rust was a big talking point back then. We never got it. They told everybody to go buy sprayers. You're going to make millions of dollars spraying for Asian soybean rust. It never even came, right? If you remember those days. In the absence of all that, keeping this plant alive longer, 7 to 10 more days, was where this was paying us. Okay, so we take that mindset, and then we look at, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to increase flower count because they're gonna shed like between 40 and 50% of the flowers that pop out on that plant are just gonna go away. So if we can increase 5% of flowers to pods, 10% of flowers to pods, how can we increase yield? We can do it very quickly, right? Those are some high percentages. So that all hinges around this early plant health fungicide shot. So if you've worked in the industry, or let's say 10 years ago you had chemical salesmen, and I'm not picking on Dean, come out to the farm that, man, we got this new fungicide. It's great. It's got a plant health label. We could spray it early in corn for plant health, right? And we all kind of laughed and like, plant health. That sounds like a sales gimmick. When we actually look at this now in this early application in soybeans, that's what we're doing, right? So growers that have done this, right? Can we move this back a little bit? Sure, because this window right here is pretty wide. This R1 to R3 window, this late V stage till the first flower pops out to this R3, that's a pretty wide gap, right? 45 days it could be. But spraying this before we get into this early flowering scenario is just reducing some of that abiotic stress. right? That's typically going to be in that late May, early June. We have cool nights there, but if we get into some warmer days, just letting that plant respire at night, recover, take up more nutrients, it's all around plant health, keeping that, right? So 2 fungicide applications, insect control, look, we're good on that. I don't have any concerns with our insect control. I have seen fall armyworm run out of a corn crop that was drying down into a soybean crop across a turn row about this wide, and the ground was just moving, right? But I don't think we're going to have any major pest outbreaks without somebody giving us a heads up, okay? So now let's look at recommendations. And as I mentioned, 50 to 100 bushels, pretty unlikely. We get into 75 bushels and we're trying to get to 100, way more likely, okay? So this is uptake charts for nitrogen and sulfur. This is R3 right here. So similar to corn, you can see that we are starting to peak out with our uptake of what's coming into the plant, but this curve is a lot less reduced. It doesn't go up into a straight bell curve because we're still growing plant material even in this R3, R4 stage. So you can see it kind of tops out here as we get into R5. You know, we're pretty much done with vegetative growth there. So, important to remember, 15 days after R5. So here's late R5 running into maturity, R6.5 as we get back here, R7, R8. 15 days after R5 until physiological maturity. In that time frame right there, which is not many days, 15, 20 days, for a maximum yield soybean, we still need 40 to 50 units of nitrogen. Okay? The plant is going to make the majority of that for us. That's at 82 bushels. So if we're at 100 bushels, that's probably 50, 60 units of nitrogen needed. But what's important to remember in this stage, especially as we get closer to R6, R6.5, are those nodules become way less effective for us. We start decreasing our nodulation past this R5 going to R6, right? The plant is like, look, we're focused now on feeding beans in the pod. And so nodulation, foliar tolerance to leaf diseases, all that decreases to make the main thing, and that is to make seed in those pods. So knowing that we are decreasing nodulation and we're still trying to pull 50 units out of here, that's where we're putting ourselves in a pinch if we're trying to go higher. Look, if you're at 60, 65 bushels, 70 bushels even, you got plenty of nitrogen. Those nodules are supplying that, you're good. But when you start saying we want to go to 100, that's where we run into a deficit for nitrogen. Just to put it into perspective, I think we showed it earlier, sulfur needs for 80 plus bushel beans is 20 pounds, 19 pounds per acre. I doubt any of us are putting that kind of sulfur rate on our soybean crop. Okay? So, recommendation. I'm going to let you take something home here. We have found through much research looking at high yield beans that when we look at 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate in this R1, R2 stage, right? And I'm not as concerned with it's got to be ammonium sulfate. What I'm concerned with is what is the best nutrient that Gilbert has available, the best packaged product, dry product, liquid product to meet the sufficiency of what we would get out of 100 pounds. So 21 pounds of nitrogen, 24 pounds of sulfur. I'm more concerned about these numbers than I am what form it's in. Fair? Okay? So that's nitrogen and sulfur and what we would need to go higher with soybean yields. So 100 pounds of AMS or an equivalent fertility with another product. Okay? When we look at potash, which has been the focus, the driver for all of our fertility decisions in soybeans for 10 years, right? We see this is a little more up and then down. And these, the dotted line, the solid line, and the dashed line, that's at different yield levels. So the dotted line is 54 bushels, the solid line is 66, and the dashed line is 82 bushels. And this is uptake per day. So if you're at 82 bushels and you're in this R2 to R3 stage, that's 5 pounds of potash per day in that time frame. Okay? So how do we increase K within our soybean crop? All right, we're good here. We got enough pre-plant. Look, we're going to make 60 bushels. Hell, if it rains, we may make 70. But we want to make 100, and we haven't planned for that. We're getting these weather patterns that are conducive. It's on our best ground. And we need to get some sulfur out there. When we look at that, right, a K-Mag type product, and again, I'm not married to the product necessarily as I am what we're getting out of it. So equivalent of K, sulfur, this is giving us some mag here too. But this is where we started. And this is where we evolved into. I probably should swap these slides. But this is where we started when we were trying to hit things. So I was in North Alabama under a pivot, right? Let me quantify all of that. And we ran this program about 5 years ago. And the beans were planted on April the 5th. And we put 200 pounds of K-Mag out. And we were clicking along, and fertility was high. And man, we were going, okay? About July the 15th, that would have been going into some serious, pod formation. We walk in the field, and I see one leaf that gives me symptomology for sudden death. I'm like, it's got to be a hoax. It's just got to be the plant. One, we looked. We came back a week later, we were seeing patches in the field. We came back a week after that, and they were almost completely defoliated in like a 3-week period, right? So the recommendation for me at that time was just keep watering them. Hell, what can you hurt at that point? I mean, we probably would have, hindsight, we probably would have pulled the water back on them just to reduce the incidence of that pathogen really exploding. But I say all that to say the whole field was treated the same. Inside the pivot and outside the pivot, all got this recommendation. Planted early, right? That brings in another issue with sudden death. There are options around that. But when we looked outside, the beans inside the pivot, where sudden death completely annihilated them, made 82 bushels. Even with all of that. The beans outside the pivot that didn't have water in a somewhat dry year made 93 under these recommendations. So if we could have kept sudden death out of that, which we had no control over at that point, couldn't spray for it. We just think about what could we have done. So we continued to run that. We started to hit some 100 bushel there. And then this evolved into, okay, so where we're not hitting 100 bushels, what's our limiting factor? And we were looking at it from a nitrogen perspective. And what was available to us was ammonium sulfate. And then that really triggered us sulfur. This and this both have sulfur. So sulfur is probably bringing us a lot more than we initially anticipated. And then when we look back at Dr. Castile's work and it's showing increased nodulation, especially late, that all makes sense. Okay? So grain removal, and we did talk about this earlier, so let's kind of flip over here. So let's look at, this is only grain removal. So what you take off in the truck, what goes in the combine, this is the amount of fertility nutrient in pounds that's coming off with it. So this is 60 bushels, 100 bushels. You can start to see these jumps that we were looking at here, right? Just to reemphasize, going from 10 pounds to 15 pounds. We've told 19 pounds earlier. So if we're going to look at sulfur, somewhere in that 15 to 20 pound range is where I would start if we're trying to get to 100. But these numbers here, right, to Gilbert's point, for grain removal only, are pretty good. Okay, this is work that Pioneer helped fund early in my agronomic career with Dr. Flannery at the University of Illinois. And this is nutrient uptake, right? So we know, let's just look at K, and is sulfur on this? I don't think sulfur's on this. Let's just look at K. What's taken off in the grain is 125 pounds. What is the sufficiency for K at 100 bushels per acre? Y'all read this number here? So to Gilbert's point earlier, and I didn't ask him to set me up for this, it just happened to work out that way. When we're looking at what do we really need to supply 100 bushels, we can't just think about what's being taken off with the seed, which this is what a lot of what we're applying today for the whole plant, not just to be taken off in seed. When we look at what's really needed to build the factory, make the pods, put the beans in there, and then plump the beans up, that's a pretty significant number. Okay? Here's what the sulfur would look like. We're still talking about that. But of the micros in soybeans, sulfur is the main driver here in pounds per acre. Okay, last thing I've got for you. I'll let you take this home with you, but Dr. Flannery's work is on the back here. There should be enough. If there's not, if you don't get one, let me know. I'll get one. And then tissue testing guidelines. You will not see K in that R5 scenario back here because, look, the focus on K is we want it to be high in that R1 and R3 stage. So wherever we top out up there, just know the lower you get in R5, the better. So that's why you won't see K in that R5 tissue testing. But looking on the front of this is exactly what we went through around maturities. And look, somebody's going to call my hand on this top one, right? On seeding rate. Here is the Kyle Holmberg seeding rate recommendation for soybeans. Get a stand the first time you go plant. If you're going to plant on April 15th and you're not comfortable with 130 or 120 pound or seeds per acre, plant 150. Get a stand the first time you go out there. If we've got a prepared seed bed, if we don't have a lot of residue out there, if the temperatures are warm and are going to be warming and you want to plant 130, absolutely. If it's going to be cold and we've got residue and we're scared about slugs and we're scared about Dean's chemistry not breaking down and injuring our beautiful Pioneer soybeans, which has been known to happen, and we want to plant 160, plant 160. But the key is you don't want to plant on April 15th and not get a sufficient stand and then don't realize that till May 10th on your best acres and you have to go in there and replant them. That takes all this out. That undoes all of this if we're trying to really feed fertility. We've got a plan to increase soybean yield, and these beans don't pop out of the ground until May 15th because we had to replant them. So that's the Kyle Holmberg public school seeding rate recommendation. If you need to plant 120, if you think you can plant 120 because of weather, do it. 130, do it. If you think it's going to take you 180 to get 130, do that. Okay. Baseline fertility we covered. Look, this at planting extras, I have put this in here because there's a lot of things out there that are working, right? We talk about humics, fulvics, cytokinins. There's a lot of things out there that work. I mean, I would rely on Corey and Ken and Ernie and Gilbert to walk you through where their confidence level is when we talk about biologicals, when we talk about root promotion, when we talk about shoot promotion, and what these different things do, because they're way more in tune with all the things in the industry and when we get down to specific branding and what they do than I am, right? I work with farmers every day. I don't listen to biological salesmen, but those guys do. So understand that they will help you walk through that. Tissue testing, obviously, right? what we talked about in corn tissue testing directly comes over as we talk about soybean tissue testing. Having a plan as you go through, looking for trends. You want to see K trending up. You want to see nitrogen trending up as we get into greater nodulation, all those things. And then I put this here for you, right? In-season fertility applications, in-season fungicide application, irrigation management, which won't cover a lot of you guys, but it kind of gives you an understanding of where it's at. And then timely harvest. I guess I can go to the next one. So we're getting a lot of, not a lot of movement, but a lot more desiccation than we were 5 years ago. Right? You guys are doing some. I was on the desiccation train earlier. I was like, man, we can spray them. We can keep our bean size plump. We can increase yield. And we can do that in certain years for sure. About 2 out of 5. What I really like from a desiccation standpoint is, again, draw a 70-mile circle around this building where we're at. How many acres in the same field are very consistent? A few. I mean, we definitely have some areas that are flat and get into river bottoms, but a lot of our ground, based on our topography of where we're at, are rolling. What this desiccation timing does is it gets all those beans in that field ready at the same time. Are you going to have a few green beans? Yeah. Are you going to have a few that are over mature? Probably. But it gets us into a spot where we're not waiting on that low spot out there to turn before we take the combine into it. And all the beans that are kind of going up this ridge here have been ready for 10 days and they're popping out. Right? We have those fields. So that's what I really like about this desiccation timing. There is an art to it, right? If it doesn't, I heard it explained best by Brewer Blessed, who some of you have heard talk. If it doesn't invoke a significant emotional response, then you're too late. And you're not doing a lot. From cleaning the field up, you're good. But if you're trying to increase yield, if it doesn't invoke a significant emotional response, you've waited a week too late. So you'll know, right? Look, when you look out there and beans are just starting to turn, and then when they kind of get that yellow hue about them, you're pretty much good to go there. And we can go through exactly when to do that. You know, it's the top 3 nodes of the plant. You want 75% of the beans to be attached from the membrane. You can read all about it online. Pioneer has plenty of videos out there. But from a cleaning up or bringing maturity of whole farms closer together is giving us some yield there too. Okay? So the last thing I want to leave you with before we eat is, look, we've talked a lot about sulfur today. We've talked a lot about a lot of things. But these are the more popular products that people are using when we talk about sulfur, and for good reason. When we come down here, ammonium sulfate, 24%. This would be a K-Mag product, 23%. Sulfate of potash, 16%. Potassium thiosulfate, 17%. Ammonium thiosulfate, 26%. Again, I'm not as married to this as I am to what we're able to utilize here from a potash perspective or a nitrogen perspective. That's what I'm focused on. So that's kind of what I want to drive into you as we finish up. That, look, some of us in this room, some of you in this room have been farming for 40 or 50 years. And we've been hearing about nitrogen and sulfur all these years. And when we talk about fertility with plants, there's no big magic orb in the sky that's bringing us new things. It's still focused around key nutrition. It's just how we utilize it now versus how we did 10, 20 years ago. That's what's evolving. There's no new nutrient that we're going to mine up out of the ground in South Africa somewhere that's going to be our savior and make us 600 bushel corn. It's going to be the things we have access to today. It's just how do we utilize them to best take advantage of that genetic gain that we see from seed companies. Okay? Questions? There's a lot of talking in an hour and 40 minutes, 30 minutes. All right, let's do this. If you have questions, come up, talk to me. I'll make sure Gilbert's up here, probably tell you a lie about something. We'll talk through specific situations on the acres you're working with. If you want to come up and call bullshit on something I've shown you, I'll be glad to entertain those comments as well. But I believe in this, and right, if you were coming in here today to hear about the latest in biologicals and how we grow 400 bushel corn by adding 2 ounces of this and 3 ounces of that and an ounce of that, I'm sorry, but I'm sorry we didn't cover that. I don't know that it's necessarily true, but I hope you're able to glean some knowledge on what we did talk about. Okay. Corey, thank you, sir.